Good evening.
Good evening.
Good to see each of you here this evening. I know it was announced a moment ago, but I would encourage you, if you cannot see these words, there are smaller ones coming. So please move forward if you're not able to see, and make sure that you're able to see what it is. I'll try to read over most of it, but I want you to see for yourself what it is that I'm going to provide for you today. One of the things I want to say before I begin is it is not my goal or my purpose to disparage any group or any individual. What I'm doing is presenting evidence and facts to you based on some things that I've done in research, and so this is going to cross over. Some of the things I'm going to present to you is going to cross over into Baptist history. And it's not my goal to disparage the Baptists. I'm not accusing them of any false representation. I'm just going to present some evidence to you, and you decide for yourself what's true and what's not true. I have on the screen history with a question mark. Before we get into that, have you ever played the telephone game? I played that as a kid in elementary school. You know, the kids would line up, the teacher had like a little phrase or something that he had, my teacher was a male, he had written on the chalkboard and covered up, and he whispered in the ear of the first child what it was that he had written on the board, and each child was supposed to whisper in the ear of the next child what it was that the first one was told, and then the last child was to say out loud what it was that he had heard, or she had heard. And if you've ever played that game, you realize that at the end of that, it's nowhere close to what was actually said. Well, how do you get what's right? You have to go back to the source. In this case, the teacher would remove that thing from the board or pull the thing out of his pocket, and you could look and find out exactly what was said to that first person there. And so the telephone game is, I think, what has occurred in history when it relates to the church history. And I think as we go through this, you'll see why it is that I say that. I asked the question, Baptist history? I asked that question at the beginning because as we go through this, I think what you're going to find is it's not Baptist history. Even though the Baptists have claimed it as their history, I think I'm going to show you this evening that it's not Baptist history. And I'm not going to do it by using members of the Church of Christ to do it. I'm not going to do it by using enemies of the Baptist church to do it. The way I'm going to prove to you that this isn't Baptist history is I'm going to use Baptist historians and the people they reference. I'm going to use the Baptist writing. I'm going to use the people that they reference as their founders, as their co-founders. And I'm going to show you that it's not really Baptist history. On the screen here is an article written by a man named Bill Pitts. You can see the name there small. You don't have to read this. But basically the title of this argument, or of this article, is Arguing Regenerate Church Membership. Listen now. Baptist identity during its first decade, 1610 to 1620. This is written by Bill Pitts. There's a couple of things I want you to notice just from the article. Number one, the Baptist, or at least Bill Pitts, believes that the Baptist church was started in 1610 or 1620. Bill Pitts believes that this is the identity of the Baptist church. Now, Bill Pitts isn't just your average, everyday person. Bill Pitts is a professor at Baylor University. Bill Pitts is not only a professor at Baylor University, he's a professor in the religious department at Baylor University. Under his academic interests and research, it says this. Here's his academic interests and his research. Baptist history and identity. 17th century England and modern American Baptist trends. I'd say this is somebody that knows something about the Baptist church, wouldn't you? He's a scholar. He's a professor. He teaches at a Baptist university in the Department of Religion. He also has a thing where he talks about, in his little biography, it says in 2009 he was on a Baptist Studies Committee where he visited libraries at Regent's Park, Oxford. That's in England. Well, the reason why that's going to be important is because some of the books that I'm going to show you today have not been in print for 400 years nearly. The only way you could have seen these books was to go to the libraries located in England where the originals are kept and somehow gained access to them. Mr. Pitts was able to do that in 2009. Here's what he says in his article. I have it highlighted there. You can't read it, but I want you to see what it says. It says, this is what he writes. First, the article is purposely restricted to publications by English Baptists in their first decade of its life, 1610 to 1620. Again, affirming the idea that the Baptist denomination began in 1610 to 1620. He then says, there are references in there, a critical response to Robinson by Baptist leader John Merton in 1620. A couple things I want you to remember from this. I want you to remember this critical response to Robinson, and notice that Mr. Pitts calls John Merton a Baptist leader. Okay, this is a professor, Baylor University, School of Religion, saying that John Merton is a Baptist leader. Now, there's a couple things I need you to understand about 17th century England. Number one, they don't know how to spell very well. A lot of them. What tends to happen is somebody's name, last name especially, is often misspelled. What you're going to find is John Merton is also known as John Morton. You're also going to find that there's an individual that we're going to talk about this evening whose name is Thomas Helwys. He's also, and his name is spelled Helwys. He's also going to be, or what we believe is his father referenced, as Helwys, Helwys. I'm also going to show you Old English writing. When we get there, I'm going to describe to you some differences in reading, because I recall the first time I tried to read it, it was very difficult. Because, number one, in Old English writing, the U's and the V's are exactly the same. The F's, as in Frank, and the S's are exactly the same. But I'll read it with you so that you can understand. Let's talk about John Merton for a moment. This is a reference to John Merton. It says he was born sometime around 1585, died around 1626, and that he was also the co-founder of the Baptist faith in Great Britain. Now, it's not just anybody saying this. Here's the references. You see the little arrow here? You can see the little arrow there says L. Rush Bush, Tom J. Nettles, Baptist in the Bible. That's a book that they wrote. The next one says, the little arrow says, First Freedom, the Baptist Perspective on Religious Liberty, B&H Publishing Group, 2007. Now, L. Rush Bush and Tom Nettles are Baptist historians and theologians. They wrote the book that's referenced there. B&H Publishing is a publishing group that's a division of Lifeway Christian Resources, which is a publication of the Southern Baptists and the Southern Baptist Convention. And they are saying John Merton is a co-founder of the Baptist faith. We're going to hear more from L. Rush Bush and Tom J. Nettles in the future, but I want to talk to you a moment about the history of three different men. These men are John Smith, Thomas Helwys, and John Merton. We talked a little bit about John Merton. I spoke a minute ago about Thomas Helwys and his spelling. We haven't talked about John Smith, but if you talk to any Baptist historian, they will tell you that the founders of the Baptist Church are John Smith and Thomas Helwys. And we just read a couple that said John Merton was a co-founder. Now, not all the Baptist historians agree with that. Some of them say that John Merton followed these men and carried on what they taught about Baptist doctrine, but that he wasn't actually a founder. But these three men are important to the Baptist faith. These are the co-founders and the men that followed, if John Merton was in fact not a co-founder. But most of the historians are going to affirm these, specifically John Smith and Thomas Helwys, are in fact the founders of the Baptist faith. Now, these men didn't know each other until 1606. 1604. And in 1604, they came to meet one another. And sometime around 1609, they fled England because of persecution, and they went to Amsterdam, Holland, to avoid persecution. You see, at the time, the Church of England, if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you were considered a heretic, and you could be thrown in jail or put to death. And in fact, at the time, the Church of England, with the Anglicans, as they were also known, they would go and check on Sundays to see whether you were in the Anglican Church or not, Church of England. And if you weren't there, you could be arrested, thrown in jail. So there was persecution going on, and these men decided to flee and go over to Amsterdam, Holland. But when they met in England. This is an article from the General Baptist Magazine, dated 1879. You can see under the first part there, it has a date, February 12, 1604. Let me give you a little background on what this is. This is the men, the quotes here are from the men that are talking about their church, and they're going to talk about meeting John Smith, and this is a quote that was attached to the General Baptist Magazine in 1879. Read the beginning, if you would, with me. February 12, 1604, John Smith, that's the same Smith, even though the spelling's a little different, vicar of Gainsborough, came inquiring about our views. He debated nearly all night with elders Henry Hellwise and John Morton, who defended our cause well. May 7th, John Smith has carefully consulted the scriptures and is convinced we are in the truth. He tells us he was deceived in the way of paedobaptistry, that's infant baptism, and does now embrace the faith in the true Christian and apostolic baptism. He discovered sweetly last night in Elder James Rayner's chamber from Lo, the Kingdom of God is Within You. It was sweet as honey. He will resign his church living, and the Church of Christ at Epworth, he says, is the true Church of Christ, has received him for baptism. March 24, 1606, this night at midnight, Elder John Morton baptized John Smith, vicar of Gainsborough, in the River Don. It was so dark we were obliged to have torchlights. Elder Brewster prayed. Mr. Smith made a good confession, walked to Epworth in his cold clothes, but received no harm. The distance was over 2 miles. All our friends were present. To the triune God be all the praise. At midnight, they walked 2 miles to baptize a man. Well, I thought the Baptists didn't believe in baptism. I thought they just waited until, they got a good group together, and then they went and baptized them together on, a convenient day. This man walked for 2 miles, and after being baptized at midnight, walked in wet clothes for over 2 miles. But notice also that it talks about elders plural. Have you ever heard elders plural in the Baptist church? I'm not familiar with them using that term. I know they use the term pastor to talk about their preacher, but I've never heard them have elders or leaders. But I want us to notice that John Smith was baptized by John Merton in 1606. Let's go back a little bit to our history of John Smith, Thomas Hellways, and John Merton. I told you they were being persecuted for their beliefs. This is after what we just read takes place. They're being persecuted for their beliefs, and they flee to Amsterdam, Holland, and they take a group of people with them. And while there, John Smith changes his view on some doctrinal matters, and he's disfellowshipped by Thomas Hellways and John Merton. This is from a book that I'm about to show you. It's written by Champlin Burridge, 1906. It's titled The Early English Dissenters in the Light of Recent Research, 1550 to 1641. Mr. Burridge is a Baptist historian from the early 1900s. Here's what he says on page 241. Before March 12, 1609-1610, Smith was encountering further troubles, this time with some of his own congregation, concerning his succession in the ministry, and all of those who did not agree with him promptly withdrew from the church. This unexpected movement was apparently led by the elders, who may have been Thomas Helways, William Piggott, Thomas Seymour, and John Merton. So we're seeing some common names being mentioned, aren't we? But I want you to notice, in 1610, remember that Mr. Pitt says the Baptist Church started between 1610 and 1620. He says that John Smith is the founder, co-founder with Thomas Helways. But in 1609 or 1610, there was a disfellowshipping that took place. They separated themselves. This is a book that is a translation, basically, of one of Thomas Helways' writings. And in the beginning of this book, there's a preface that's written by a guy by the name of Richard Groves. He gives us some background, and at the time of the writing, which was 1998, Richard Groves was the pastor at the Wake Forest Baptist Church on the campus of the Wake Forest University. He also served as an instructor at several colleges, including Baylor University. Here's what he says on preface page XXIII, or 23. In the highlighted area, Helways group consisting of Helways and possibly 10 others excommunicated Smith and declared themselves the true church. So there's a disfellowshipping that takes place. Going back to what Mr. Burridge writes, actually this is Mr. Groves again, this is preface page XVI, or number 16. He says the Gainsborough group, remember we talked about John Smith being that vicar of Gainsborough in that article that we read, the Gainsborough group divided over ecclesiological differences, with half following John Smith and joining the Dutch Mennonites, and half following Thomas Helways and returning to England. Now, Smith never returned to England. John Smith died in the area, they believe, of Holland, sometime shortly after this disfellowshipping took place. The estimates are that he died in the year 1610 to 1612. The reason why there's a range there is because some other people's writings indicate after 1612 that he's already dead. So John Smith never returns to England. But there's more to that. Because according to Mr. Burridge, what happened to Smith's followers after they had been deserted by Helways and Merton, and after their application to the Waterlanders has been passed over, is not quite clear. You see, nobody knows what happened to John Smith's followers. John Smith died, they presume, in Holland. He never returned to England. The Baptists all claim that the Baptist Church was started in England by John Smith and Thomas Helways. But notice, they divided over doctrine. John Smith never to return, and John Smith's followers, they don't know what happened to him. Well, if they don't know what happened to him, they can't be the beginning of the Baptist Church. I don't agree with all of what's said here, but this is what Mr. Groves says on preface page XXIV, that's 24. He says, if it can be said that John Smith founded the first English Baptist church, though not on English soil, it can be said that Thomas Helways founded in 1612 the first Baptist church on English soil. I want you to notice what Mr. Burridge says. He says this on page 251. So far as is known, the first English Anabaptist congregation to be settled in England was that led by Thomas Helways and John Merton. So these two men, according to Mr. Burridge, this Baptist historian, these two men are the founders of the first, he calls, English Anabaptist congregation in England. This is a writing from that same article, the General Baptist Magazine, 1879, that I read to you earlier. Under the quoted area is an area that these people, the ones that we read the article of, they quoted this. Listen to what it says. We, this church of Baptist Church meeting in Epworth. No, it doesn't say that. We, this Anabaptist Church meeting in Epworth. No, it doesn't say that. It says, we, this Church of Christ meeting in Epworth, Crowley, and West Butterwick in the county of Lincoln, whose names are underwritten, 32 signatures or marks, give ourselves to the Lord and to one another according to ye will of God. We do promise and covenant in the presence of Christ to walk together in the laws and ordinance of baptized believers according to ye rules of ye gospel through Jesus Christ, so helping us, elders of the church, John Merton or Morton, James Rainier, Henry Hellwise, William Brewster, William Bradford. Again, we see a plurality of elders in a congregation. We see the name that they use is not the one you would typically see if they were the founders of something. What you see here are we, this Church of Christ. Now, Merton and Hellways did return to London, England, and they did start a congregation, but contrary to Baptist historians, it wasn't a Baptist church. How do we know that? Well, first of all, we can say they didn't call themselves a Baptist church. They didn't use that name. They used the name Church of Christ. And you might say, well, anybody could use the name Church of Christ. That doesn't really tell us about their belief system. How is it that they weren't the First Baptist Church? How do we know? Well, we know that when John Smith met them, they called themselves also the Church of Christ. Here's how we also know that the name Baptist, or that they weren't a Baptist church. This is found in Burge, page 26. He says this, the name Baptist or Baptist, remember this is written by a Baptist historian, appears never to have been used before 1641 to those English people who espoused the cause of Anabaptism, and accordingly the name by which they were known to the public during this period has here been employed. So the name Baptist or Baptist wasn't even used until 1641. Do you remember the year that they returned from Amsterdam? 1610. This is 31 years later that the first time the Baptist name is used. We see the first time Baptist is used is 1641. John Smith, as I indicated to you earlier, died between 1610 and 1612. Thomas Hellways died in 1616. John Merton died in 1626. How could they be the founders of a church 20 years later? They're dead. But who were these men? If they weren't Baptists, how do we determine what it is they were? How do we determine what these men were religiously? Well, we could ask the question, what did they call themselves? And we've already seen, and we're going to see more of what they called themselves. But anybody could use the name Church of Christ. In fact, today there are churches that exist in this country that have the name Church of Christ, but they're not teaching the doctrine of Christ. They may have the name, but they're not members of the church. So how else do you determine who these men were? Well, we can ask the question, what were their beliefs? I want to show you this book. I have it right here. It's written by John Merton, as you can see on the title. On the last page, it's signed this way. The king, I told you the U's and V's are the same, and the F's and S's look the same. I'll read it for you. The king's majesty, loyal subjects, in all lawful obedience, unjustly called Anabaptists. Signed by John Merton, 1621. Here's what Thomas Crosby says. He's also a Baptist historian. I don't have this book because I have it on computer. Here's what he says. The Anabaptists, according to his account, held that repentance and faith must precede baptism, that the baptism of both the Church of England and of the Puritans was invalid, and that the true baptism was amongst them. He says further that they complained against the term Anabaptist as a name of reproach unjustly cast upon them. They didn't like the name Anabaptist. You Campbellites. Would you like it if somebody called you a Campbellite? What if 100 years from now, a group of people came around and said, we're followers of Alexander Campbell, we're Campbellites, and we can trace our roots back to 1810. Would it be true? Just because somebody used a derogatory name, such as Campbellite or Anabaptist, doesn't mean that that's what their belief system is. I have here another book. It's old. You can't touch it. I don't want your dirty little fingers on it. It was written in 1645 by the man that's listed up there. His name is Daniel Featley. Daniel Featley was a member, or what you might call a clergy, for the English or the Church of England at the time. He was an Anglican theologian. In fact, he was the youngest member of the translation committee of the King James Bible in 1611. In this book he writes, it's called, one thing about these old books is they got longer names than I don't know what. But in this book it's called The Dippers Dipped and the Anabaptists Ducked and Plunged over head and ears at the dispensation of southward, together with a large and full discourse of their one original, two several sorts, three peculiar errors. 1645. Let me tell you what's going on here. What's taking place is Daniel Featley is debating a group of Anabaptists. And in this debate, he's pointing out what he believes to be their error. He then writes that information down, and then he talks in the second half of the book, he talks about the different Anabaptist groups that are out there. So he doesn't lump them all into one group. Here's what he says on page 203. Remarkable histories of the Anabaptists with observations therein. Let me read this with you. Lastly, in their confession printed this year, they find themselves aggrieved with the name Anabaptists, saying they are falsely so called. Yet it is well known they all of them either rebaptize or are rebaptized, and consequently are properly Anabaptists, actively or passively. Let me tell you what's taking place. These supposed, first of all, I don't know if I explained this or not, but Anabaptist, Anna means reed. So what they've attached this title Anabaptist to mean rebaptized. So what's taking place is the Church of England have baptized people as infants. These men and their groups do not believe in infant baptism. So when they join these groups, guess what they have to do? They have to be rebaptized. Now, in the mind of somebody that believes in infant baptism, that's a waste of time. But in the mind of those Christians, technically you're not even being rebaptized. You're being baptized for the first time because you just got wet as a baby. And that's why they're aggrieved, as it says here, with that name. Now, he makes reference to a tract or a flyer. I happen to have a copy of that here. I'll zoom it in so you can read it, and we'll read it together. A censure of a book printed anno 1644, that's the year 1644, entitled The Confessions of Faith of Those Churches Which Are Commonly, though falsely, called Anabaptists. Subscribed by them in the behalf of 7 congregations or churches of Christ in London, as also by a French congregation of the same judgment. And then you have the list of the men see, these men were aggrieved with the name Anabaptists. John Merton was unjustly called an Anabaptist. Thomas Helways is unjustly called an Anabaptist. See, that was a derogatory name meant to describe the actions in which they were doing when people from the Church of England were coming to their belief system. I want to get back to Mr. Pitts and his article. Mr. Pitts, in his article, references John Merton. Here's what he says. He says, John Merton emerged as an able spokesman for the early English Baptists. In 1620, Merton wrote a description of what God had predestined concerning man. He then talks about that critical response. Remember, I told you to remember a critical response to Robinson by Baptist leader John Merton. I happen to have that book. It hasn't been in print for over almost 400 years. And it's not really in print now. What somebody did was they photocopied the original and put it into a book. But I want you to notice what Mr. Pitts referenced is the same book I have. John Merton emerged as able spokesman in 1620. Notice in parentheses below, 1620. John Merton wrote a description of what God had predestined concerning man. Title of this book, A Description of What God Had Predestined Concerning Man. He then talked about critical response to Robinson by Baptist leader John Merton in 1620. Notice the bottom half of that, the third line from the bottom, as also an answer to John Robinson touching baptism. I'd say this is the book that Mr. Pitts is talking about, wouldn't you? So, if John Merton is a Baptist co-founder, certainly we should be able to look at his belief system and determine whether that's true or not. Well, what does John Merton say about some things? What does he say about once saved, always saved? This is a common Baptist doctrine, although not all Baptists espouse it. But they believe once you become a Christian, then you can't fall away. So what does John Merton say in this book about that? Well, here's what he says. First, the scriptures teach us that godly men that are in the true and saving grace of God may fall away. Okay, that's on page 78. On page 79 he says this, a man having true grace may fall away even as Esau lost his earthly inheritance which he had a right unto. Also on page 79 he says this, yea, those that Christ hath bought with his precious blood may be damned. Wait, what? Wait, what? Put on the next highlighted area. That they that have faith in a good, that's conscience, may put it away and make shipwreck of it, that some may leave their first faith and be damned, that some written in the book of life may be put out. You think John Merton believes in once saved, always saved? I don't think so. But not all Baptists believe in once saved, always saved. So that may not be the best argument. But I don't know any Baptist that believes baptism for salvation, do you? What say you, John Merton, in reference to baptism? What do you say? What do you espouse? Listen to what he says. That the members and churches of Christ are so made by faith and baptism, even by both, it is proved in Romans 11:20 and following. Down to the next highlighted area. And Romans 6:3 and following, they were grafted into Christ and his death by baptism, according to Christ's commandment in his commission. You remember that commandment in the commission? Mark 16:15 and 16. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. He who does not believe shall be condemned. Here, John Merton is saying in Romans 6:3 and following, and we all know that, right? That text that talks about being baptized into Christ's death and that you're raised a new creature. Romans 6:3 and following. He says that members in churches of Christ are made by faith and baptism. Let's go back to Mr. Pitts for a moment, because he actually quotes this. And I don't want to assume that Mr. Pitts is wrong, so I'll just show you what he wrote. Here's what he says. Merton urged that the members of the true Church of Christ were made by faith. This, he argued, was proved by Romans 11:20. Wait, I thought there was something different in that quote. I thought he said that the members of churches of Christ are so made by faith and baptism, even by both, that is proved in Romans 11:20 and following. Now, I don't know why Mr. Pitts left that part out, but obviously, if we were playing the telephone game, we got a problem, don't we? Because if somebody listens or reads Mr. Pitt's work, they're going to believe that Mr. Merton said faith only in Romans 11 is proved by Romans 11:20. But is that what Mr. Merton said? You see, when you go back to the source, you get the accurate information. And unfortunately, this source has not been in print for nearly 400 years. See, your average person couldn't go over to England and open up one of these old books and read it. You had to be some kind of scholar to be able to do that. But in today's environment of internet, you know the reason why these books are now in print? They started regulating or monitoring Google, and whatever they started Googling, they put it in print. Going back to the source. Here's what Mr. Merton also says. He says on page 156, thus was the members, this is faith and baptism he's talking about still, thus was the members and churches of Jerusalem made, which was the first Baptist church. Church of Christ. Now, if you're not convinced by his belief in baptism, let me read you this, and I doubt you will not be convinced. The manifestation of faith in baptism is Christ joined together, and what is mortal man that he should separate them? This is the door into his kingdom, by which if any man enter, he shall go in and out and find pasture. And whosoever climbeth up another way, they are thieves and robbers. This is the word of the Lord, and it endureth forever, and it must be kept without spot until Christ's appearing. And cursed are they that teach otherwise. John Merton in this book teaches against John Calvin's doctrine of predestination and election. He teaches against once saved, always saved, as we saw a moment ago. He teaches against premillennialism. He teaches that a man has free will. He teaches against original sin. He teaches salvation is only in the Church of Christ. And he teaches entrance into the church of Christ by being baptized into Christ. That's what the source teaches. Thomas Helways. He teaches a plurality of elders. He teaches autonomy. If you're not familiar with that word, that means that each local congregation oversees itself. There is no centralized board that decides what the church teaches. Well, Thomas Helways teaches autonomy. He teaches baptism was not a church covenant. And he teaches baptism for salvation. Let me read you this. On page 253 of Champlin Burridge's book. Remember, Baptist historian, not our words. Here's what he writes. Helways would also make believers' baptism an absolute necessity for salvation. You ever heard a Baptist say that? I never have. I told you we're going to get back to L. Rush Bush and Tom J. Nettles. This is what they say on page 26 of their book, Baptists in the Bible. They say Anabaptists should not be simplistically identified with modern Baptists. Some significant points of difference exist. Oh, I agree. However, Anabaptists set forth many ideas that influenced the eventual development of the Baptist life and gave living proof that the principle of sola scriptura, Bible only, you ever heard that? Could lead to determined efforts to reestablish the New Testament pattern for the church. Kind of sounds like the Restoration movement, doesn't it, Delbert? So, isn't that what Alexander Campbell said? Let's go back to Scripture. What do the sources tell us? Well, number one, they tell us the Church of Christ was documented as being in existence in England in the early 1500s. They were called by the name Anabaptists as a derogatory name. The Baptists had falsely called these Christians as Baptists, probably because of that derogatory name Anabaptist, because that's how their enemies identified them. And so when you have that idea of Anabaptist, maybe they took that little stem word Baptist and applied it to them. But the fact of the matter is, John Merton, Thomas Helways, even John Smith were all dead before the name Baptist was ever used in 1641. John Smith and Thomas Helways had a doctrinal difference where a disfellowshipping took place. So whatever it was, they were not the same. Whatever they were religiously, they were not the same. Thomas Helways and John Merton returned to England from Amsterdam. They began a church. They used the same name that they used prior to that, which was Church of Christ. And they taught the doctrines and principles found in the Scriptures, the very same things that we teach today. If we were to find the church in history, how would you identify it? Would it not be maybe by the name they use, but definitely by the doctrine that they teach? What do these men teach doctrinally? What do they call themselves? I hope that as you saw and I presented this information, you see and can examine for yourself who these men were. This is over 200 years before Alexander Campbell and his father Thomas Campbell were born. Those Baptists that like to say that the Church of Christ was started with those two men and Barton Stone ought to read their own history. Because according to this, they came around after the Church of Christ. Now we understand the seed principle, and that is, if you take the Word of God and you plant it in a good and honest heart, what you're going to get as a Christian. And we understand that we don't have to go through history and prove that the church existed in every time frame within history. You know why we don't have to do that? Because God promised that the gates of Hades would not prevail against His kingdom. But when the church is under persecution and in hiding, difficult to find them in history. And up until recently, difficult to find the church in history in England. Not so much anymore. Not so much anymore. I haven't used one member of the Lord's church to prove this case to you. But the reason why I began this quest over 5 years ago to investigate this information, to purchase these books, and to make a determination is because of this book that I read called Traces of the Kingdom. It's written by a man named Keith Sisman. He's a brother in the Lord's church in England where he preaches. He wrote this book and he documents in the book, he says that he can prove the church in existence back to the 10th century. Now when I read this book, I read parts of it and I didn't want to just take his word for it either. That's why I purchased these books and started investigating on my own to determine whether what he said was correct or not. I think what he said was correct. These men were not part of the Baptist church. I told you at the beginning it's not my goal to disparage them, that is the Baptists, and it's not. But if you go online right now, you can find a website after website that calls you a Campbellite. If you watch the debate that recently took place between a Baptist preacher and a preacher from the Church of Christ, he referenced Alexander Campbell as if somehow Campbell is the founder of the Church of Christ, which he's not. By the way, I don't even agree with some of the beliefs Campbell had. Why do I bring this up? Why stir this pot? Why create this animosity, if you will? Why challenge these historians and these men that have put these things in? Well, because number one, I think it's important for us to know what the truth is in reference to history. And number two, this has been used for many years to disparage the Lord's church. And I don't believe any man has a right to disparage the Lord's church. The Lord's church is the bride of Christ. You men who have wives, would you let somebody talk bad about your wife? I don't think so. Jesus isn't happy when you talk bad about his wife either. I presented this material so that you might know and have confidence in the fact that the Church of Christ was not started by Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, and Thomas Campbell. Those men weren't anywhere around, weren't even thought of when these men existed in England. And if you read Traces of the Kingdom, and I haven't been able to verify the additional information, Brother Sisman claims that you can go back all the way to the 10th century and find the church in England. And if that's the case, we can go further back in history. We don't need to, by the way. We don't need to go all the way back to the church, because here's how we can identify the church. The same way we looked at John Merton and their belief system, you go to the New Testament, you find out how it was that the church worshiped God, you find out what their beliefs were, and you emulate that, guess what you are? The Lord's church. You see, when the seed is planted in the honest hearts of men, it creates Christians. Never will the seed, and the seed only, placed in the honest hearts of men, create a Baptist. Never will it create a Methodist. And I don't mean to be disrespectful when I say that, but it won't. See, you've got to have something other than the Bible to create a Methodist. And if you watched that debate last week, by the way, the Baptist preacher said it's harder to get into Christ than it is to get, or harder to get into the church than it is to get into Christ. Can you believe that? It's harder to get into the church than it is to get into Christ. Here's the problem with that thinking. Those are both the same. You see, those in Christ are the church. Those that are the church are in Christ. I don't know where the idea ever came from that there's a difference. Jesus doesn't talk about the bride of Christ and that harlot woman on the side that's not the bride of Christ. There's only one bride. That's the church. So I present this information so that you can be secure in your thoughts and know. And you should be able to do this by going back to the New Testament and know what it is you believe in is, in fact, that you are the Lord's people. Have confidence in that. Don't let somebody come around and call you a derogatory name like they called these men Anabaptists. Don't let them come around and call you Campbellites and you not be able to answer them. You stand up and answer them. You can do it gently. You can do it calmly. You can do it nicely. But you can do it. Let me throw a little bit of a warning out. Please don't go to your Baptist friends tomorrow and say, "Aha! I got you!" Please don't. You'll mess up my last few sermons on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. This is information that's important to us, and we should know it. We need to know it. But it's not information that should be used to beat anybody else down. We can challenge folks. We can question folks. We can show them the facts without beating them down. So I encourage you that as you go about talking to your friends, look through some of this information and see if you can't come up with a nice way to help show your Baptist friends the truth on this subject. At this point, that was the end of my presentation. I hope that you found this useful. I put a lot of work into this, and so I take a lot of pride in this work. It's not my material. As I told you, most of the resources I use, if not all of them, came out of that book, Traces of the Kingdom. I just went and did the research for myself. I haven't gone to England yet. Maybe in the future, who knows. But you can look these materials up as well. And I encourage you. I gave you page numbers so that you could do it for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Look it up yourself and read it for yourself and determine whether it's true or not.